Jessie could hear the back door banging lightly, randomly, in the October breeze blowing around the house. The jam always swallowed in the fall, and you really had to give the door a yank to shut it. This time, they had forgotten. She'd thought of telling Gerald to go back and shut the door before they got too involved, or that banging would drive her nuts. Then, she thought how ridiculous that would be, given the current circumstances. It would ruin the whole mood. Gerald's Game, Stephen King's 19th novel, was originally a big change of pace for the dear master of horror. It had been a while since he gave us a story with very short character count. In fact, at this point, Gerald's Game is the novel with the least number of named characters and the only one where we have long chapters where there is only one person present in the room, and it's as every bit as claustrophobic as Misery or The Shining. It is also the first novel where King decided to grapple on directly with two subjects that had always been on the background of his novels, one way or another. The horrible truth of child molestations and its consequences, and the equally devastating nature of spousal abuse, and how, back in the early 1990s, yes, hey, horribly enough, both seemed to be invisible for far too many people. I'm AdalisaZ, and I hope you guys are ready as well as hydrated, because we're going to visit a woman who made the worst choice of her life when she agreed to play one last round of Gerald's Game. We have seen that Stephen King has a very specific interest in exploring the consequences of addiction in his works, given that pretty much every single one of the novels we have reviewed so far has an addict or two as characters. However, what I have not mentioned as much is that he seems to have an equally important interest on the consequences of domestic abuse to all ages and genders. We will delve a bit more on this when we get to the survivor of violence in the Stand videos, but let's give a quick recap for this. In pretty much every novel from Carrie to, well, the most recent, we have a character that is very clearly a victim of domestic violence. Yes, hey, you're right. From the titular Carrie herself, to Sue Nell having to live under her mother's thumb, to Wendy Torrance, and so on. We can see a very clear trail of people who don't have the perfect family life. Just in Needful Things, or last novels, we had 3 examples. Nettie Cobb, who had finally snapped and killed her husband, but had remained traumatized for his actions to the point that she seemed unable to defend herself from anyone looking mean at her, or looking at her, or breathing in her general direction. Pete Jersick, Wilma's husband, who was so cowed by his wife's personality and actions that he had even gotten to secretly drug her in hopes that she would calm down a bit instead of treating him like a doormat, and Myrtle Keaton, who considered herself lucky that her husband loved her despite how stupid and clumsy she was, and he had always had to remind her, up to the moment when he killed her with a hammer. The most important thing is that King doesn't go the easy route of claiming that domestic violence has to be physical to be terrifying, nor that only women are victims of such violence. More importantly, while we may remember some of the survivors because they had to fight their spouses, mostly he deals with the recurring generational trauma that domestic violence creates. Let's take as an example The Shining. While thanks to the movie most will remember Jack Torrance as a horrible man who tried to kill his wife with an axe, readers of the novel know that Jack was a survivor of domestic violence at hands of his father, who once beat his mother so hard in front of him and his brothers that she lost her memory not only of the beating but of most of the day, while Wendy herself was also a victim of emotional abuse at the hands of her mother, an abuse so deep that she would rather take her chances with the Overlook and the possessed Jack than with her mother. Consider that. The novel makes very, very clear that most of the buttons that Jack has for the hotel to push come from the traumatic memories of his father's treatment, which also included throwing 7-year-old Jack to the nearest wall when he was in a good mood. On It and the Talisman, he also briefly touched on the possibility of molestations as a source of trauma, but he never expanded much on it. The most we had was Beverly running away from her father, and her mother asking her if he had ever touched her, with Beverly not quite understanding what she meant. But even so, it's clear that Bev married an abuser mostly due to the way her father treated her and how she dealt with her trauma about that time it possessed him. And all of that brings us back to Gerald's game. But first, as always, a quick recap of the plot. Jessie Burlingame and her husband Gerald have been married for a while, and, as with all couples, that means that their sex life needs a bit of spice to keep going. One time, a bit before the novel begins, Gerald suggested adding some light bondage to see if that kept the motor running, and they start a game where Jessie will be tied to the bed and Gerald will tame his proud beauty. At first, Jessie was somewhat curious of the game, especially when it involved silk scarves and nothing more serious. But when Gerald suggests a quick getaway to their lake house on a weekend to try out a new prop, actual, real police handcuffs, Jessie starts having second thoughts. Unfortunately, she doesn't voice said reluctance until Gerald has her handcuffed and half naked on the bed. And at first she thinks that the reason why Gerald is not stopping and uncuffing her is because he thinks it's part of the game. She is, after all, supposed to resist. But when she realizes that, nope, Gerald is very much aware that she is not in the mood and doesn't care, she fights him, kicking on the chest, causing him to have a fatal heart attack. Problem is, the keys to the handcuffs are in the dresser in the other side of the room. And absolutely no one knows that they had gone to the cabin that weekend, so no one will think that they are missing until at least 4 days have passed, because this is pre-cell phones and Alexa or Siri, where you can say, "Hey Siri, call 911.
I'm sorry, I can't call emergency services here. Please use your phone."
Thank you, Siri. 4 days that Jessie definitely doesn't have, as she has no food or water to survive. And that's when the voices start. And she has to remember another time when she was helpless at a lake shore, no matter how much she has fought to never think about that again. Because pretty much 79% of the novel has Jessie tied up to the bed, and nothing more, we get to know her very well. From the beginning, when Gerald was still alive and Jessie is wondering why the hell she allowed herself to be convinced that being tied up was a good idea, to the moment when she realizes that the reason she had to relive her most secret and deep trauma was to find a way to escape her situation, pretty much we have her and her thoughts. Sure, there is a bit of extra action, such as when a stray dog, formerly called Prince, as the narration tells us, managed to get into the house and decides to start snacking on Gerald, or the strange figure that Jessie christens the space cowboy who comes at night to laugh at her misery. But other than that, it's her, alone in bed, either considering that she's going to die, arguing with herself about whose fault it is that they are in this situation, or, again, remembering that one time when she stayed alone with her father to watch an eclipse when she was only 10 years old. I am not going to lie to you. Gerald's Game is a very uncomfortable novel to read, especially if you are or know a survivor of abuse, because by virtue of being alone, Jessie can't avoid thinking about everything that happened to her in excruciating detail. Jessie can't avoid thinking about everything that happened to her in excruciating detail. Even more importantly, she will at times blame herself for things that she had no way of stopping or preventing. Even after almost being raped by her own husband, She starts the novel by telling herself that the whole situation was her fault, because all she had to do was to lay there and let him get it out of his system. At the same time that part of her recognizes that thinking that way is not only unhelpful, but also quite false, as she is taking all the responsibility away from Gerald and men in general. And this is where the voices come in. See, I could make the argument that Jessie has DAD, as during the novel there are 3 very distinct voices in her head besides herself, whom she identifies by different names and who at times seems to know things that she doesn't know. I don't know if King was intending her to be a system or just pegged on the most common forms of plurality usually seen as just talking to yourself, but the truth is that the 3 main voices besides Jessie are incredibly important, and thus it's a pity that the movie, which is very good except for this, did away with them. First, we have good wife Burlingham, who is, according to Jessie, the oldest of the voices, who has been with her for a long time, ever since she was 10. Goody, as she's also called, would have been quite familiar to many women. She is the one who says that Jessie should have kept her mouth shut and her legs open instead of telling Gerald that she didn't enjoy the game anymore. That if she had just let him have his way with her, he'd have uncuffed her at the end, and then she could have thought about silly thoughts like divorce or other nonsense. Of course, with the knowledge that, if Jessie listens to Goody, she will never divorce Gerald. After Gerald dies, Goody first goes into a complete meltdown because she declares Jessie a murderer and from then on managed to make herself the least useful voice for most of the time, insisting that they will be rescued somehow, that they will end up in jail for killing Gerald, but alive, and of course that this is all Jessie's fault. It takes her a long time to get out of that particular tune, because Goody is the voice of the status quo, a voice that was created after a big trauma and who will go on long lengths to keep the apparent calm of Jessie's life as quiet and tranquil as possible. Unfortunately, this means that Goody is quite self-hating. She constantly hates Jessie and herself for the choices they make, and at one point, Jessie sees her in her mind as a Victorian woman held up in the stocks for the crime of being her, and unable and unwilling to defend or free herself. Even when Goody makes a couple of good suggestions because she wants to leave, she's still, at the end, the voice of internalized misogyny, which, as I said, unfortunately, is very common. Then we have Ruth, named after Jessie's old college roommate. Ruth is the angriest of the voices, as well as the newest. She comes up right when Jessie realizes that Gerald knows that she doesn't want to play the game and plans to pretend he didn't know as he raped her. In a way, it's Ruth the one who kicks Gerald and kills him, and she is the one who at first keeps pushing Jessie to try and find a way out. She is the voice of female empowerment, the one who says, "No Prince Charming is coming, you have to get out of this tower yourself." And most importantly, the one who is not willing to let Jessie bury her past. Even as Ruth grows scared that they might die chained to the bed, she will still insist that the worst thing Jessie can do is just ignore what happened to her before, and that remembering shouldn't mean to blame herself. Which brings us to Pumpkin and the real meat of the book. Pumpkin is Jessie's inner child, a version of her as a twin between 10 and 13 who really doesn't like to speak up. While she doesn't agree with Goody's view of their situation, she also doesn't think that they are innocent either. And of course, she is the keeper of Jessie's worst memory, the trauma that triggered Jessie into finally put a stop to the abuse she had suffered at Gerald's hand, and put her in the worst possible situation, which forced her to face said trauma. The worst part for Jessie is that the only way out of her current problem lies precisely in the memory that Pumpkin keeps and that Jessie would love to never think about again. So let's talk now about the abuse and the trauma. And I'm going to start with the abuse because, believe it or not, it is the softer subject. And of course, although I love you guys here, if you think that talking about domestic abuse and child abuse is not going to be good for your mental health, this is the time where we say goodbye, and I will see you here for the next 2 books, because the next one also has, there will be trigger warnings. Before Gerald dies, when Jessie is trying to convince him to get her off the handcuffs, she starts considering how their marriage has gone off the rails. She remembers how much she dislikes certain parts of his personality, but wouldn't voice it to him as that would be cruel, at the same time that she remembers that one time when he wanted to get a Porsche, and she insulted him so that he would consider going to the gym instead. In short, she's putting herself in the role of the nagging wife, despite the fact that she's very obviously not. After all, she is indulging him in a sexual roleplay that she doesn't really enjoy, and it's implied that she has never fully enjoyed sex with him either, as she points out that multiple orgasms are not a common situation for her. And it's just now when she's speaking out, sure that Gerald will listen to her. It's not only after Gerald is dead when she starts considering how horrible it was that Gerald was willing to pretend that he thought that she was playing when she said that she didn't want to have sex while handcuffed, that he planned to make the last time she would let him cuff her be worth the fact that she will never hold her hands up again. And then there is also the thing that people who know a little bit about BDSM asks why there was not a safe word. But then Gerald was not a good man. That's also when she lets herself wonder why her husband had insisted on finding real cuffs instead of the ones actually used for sex play, or keep using scarves as they had done before. Then we learned that Gerald was incredibly controlling, even making her quit her job as a teacher because it seemed wrong to have her working when he was a lawyer in high demand. The fact that Jessie liked her job, that it made her feel useful, is something that not only Gerald never considers, it's something that she never voices out loud. After all, as Goody keeps telling her, it is better to let him have what he wants. Keep the peace is important, and why does it matter that she has to quit something she loves? The important thing is to keep him happy, because as much as she hates when he talks to her as if she was stupid, as much as he keeps making her feel unlovable, he loves her, right? And that is why it's important to keep up the appearances, which is also the reason why she's in trouble. Everyone thinks that she and Gerald have the perfect marriage, so no one would think that there is something wrong with their absence. She also mentions that she has very few friends because, well, her social circle is incredibly small, in big part thanks to the fact that she keeps shooting people out if they get a bit too close to her childhood trauma, but also because Gerald doesn't like her going out. And here is where we get into the worst part. Right before kicking Gerald, Jessie thinks to herself that she wouldn't let him put out the sun, and then she wonders why she thought that. But as time passes, Ruth, Goody, and even Pumpkin force her to face that memory, and boy, it is hard. Because you see, when she was 10 years old, Jessie was molested at her family lake's house, in a different lake from where she is now, but close enough to bring back the memory by the smell of the water alone, by her own father, who manipulated everything to gaslight her into thinking that it had been her idea to be alone with him, to wear skimpy clothing and to tempt him. Not only that, but after the fact, he made sure that she'd never tell her mother what had happened, by making completely sure that she'd always blame herself and not him. While it was only one time, and her memories seemed to indicate that he was somewhat regretful, the damage he did to her both in her psyche and her awareness of her body was eternal, to the point that she is even still defending him in her head, as she argues with Ruth, Goody, and even Pumpkin that he never meant for it to happen. The fact that we, the readers, and she, deep down, know that he absolutely planned everything. Which is, of course, the greatest horror in Gerald's game. Sure, the situation in which Jessie is horrifying, and her thirst, hunger, and desperate measures to escape are described in every gruesome detail. But all of that is not as horrible as knowing how a child can be betrayed by the man she loved the most, how she got brainwashed into blaming herself, and thus hating herself, as we see in the voice of Goody, and how deep those scars go. Especially because, unfortunately, those kind of monsters are far more common in real life than everything else that happens in this story. Gerald's Game is a very dark book, but it's a great introductory book to Stephen King's style if you haven't read anything by him before. It's not as long as other of his books, so you are not making a big commitment, and because of the nature of the premise, it has few characters and a very satisfying ending. More importantly, although it still follows the formula I discuss in my The Stand videos, it is not as obvious as other books, as it neatly avoids many of the so-called Stephen King tropes. You will not find a gang of bullies here, I can assure you that. At the same time, I still have to warn you that it may not be for everyone's cup of tea, given how there is no clear enemy to be beaten. We don't have a Randall Flagg, a Leland Gaunt, or a Greg Stilson to hate. We don't even have a Jack Torrance, given that Gerald pretty much dies in Chapter 1, and Jessie's father, who is arguably a bigger monster, has been dead for years before the novel starts. And as I said, the abuse descriptions may be a bit triggering to some. So yes, I recommend the book, but with caution. Same goes with the movie. While I understand why they decided to do away with Rod and Pumpkin, I am not that sure that them changing Goody for a hallucination of Gerald works, as it ends up making Gerald a bit sympathetic. Still, I'd give it a watch if I were you, and I would love to know your opinions in the comment section below. I want to thank my dear patrons, Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, Jessie, Canelli Riley, as well as my first supporter Tanya Pineda and Amy Sung, who is the best person in the universe and without whom these videos will not exist. I also want to remind you that if you want to support this and my other projects and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/AdalisaZ, with a link on the description, as I know my name can be hard to spell. And with just $1 USD a month, you will always be thanked in my videos, as well as to get access to a ton of art before anyone else. Or, if you prefer a one-off offer, at Coffee with just one donation of 3 USD, you will get a mention in the next 3 videos I make. If you can't support me this way, I will also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, and of course, you sharing the links. I also welcome all your questions, feedbacks, and suggestions in the comments below. And now, well, Jessie's story is over, but we still have to go back to that eclipse when her innocence was shattered. Just a little bit more to the east of where she was. We're going to meet a woman named Dolores Claiborne, who just happens to know that sometimes an accident is a woman's best friend.